This file from the summer of 1968 brings us to the quiet suburbs of Lansing, Illinois, where a 17-year-old's routine walk to a neighbor's house became an encounter that would challenge our understanding of what's possible in modern America. You're browsing the Cryptid Archives, narrative short stories based on real cryptid encounters, presented by Cryptids Across the Atlas. Shadow over Torrence Avenue. The summer of 1968 was a time when the world seemed to be cracking at its seams. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated that spring. Cities were erupting in protests, and the Vietnam War dominated every television screen. But in Lansing, Illinois, our corner of suburban Chicago maintained a careful pretense of normalcy. We were a community defined by our ordinariness. Neat rows of single-family homes, carefully maintained lawns, and the constant background hum of progress from nearby Interstate 394. Our house sat just off Torrence Avenue, that busy artery that connected us to the beating heart of Chicago proper. Lansing had grown rapidly in the post-war boom, transforming from farmland to suburb in what felt like the blink of an eye. The older residents still talked about when our streets were dirt roads, when the land held more corn than concrete. Sometimes I wondered if the speed of that change had left something unsettled in the fabric of reality itself. That thought would come back to haunt me later. The day itself started ordinarily enough. Summer break stretched ahead of me like an endless promise, that peculiar moment between childhood and adulthood when anything seemed possible, but nothing seemed urgent. The radio that morning had been full of news about the space race. NASA was making preparations for what would eventually become the Apollo program. The idea that humans might soon walk on the moon made the impossible feel somehow closer, more tangible. If only I'd known how personal that lesson in impossibility was about to become for me. It was late afternoon when I stepped out to visit my friend next door. The sun hung low enough to paint long shadows across our street, but there was still plenty of daylight left. The air felt heavy, with that distinctive Midwest humidity that makes everything feel slightly slower, slightly more dreamlike. The temperature had been climbing all day, hitting that sweet spot where the asphalt starts to shimmer, but before the real heat sets in. The first thing that struck me was the silence. Not just quiet, silence. The kind of absolute stillness that makes your ears strain for any sound at all. No birds called from the maple trees that lined our street. No dogs barked in the distance. Even the usual drone of traffic from the I-394 seemed muted, as if something had draped a heavy blanket over our corner of the world. Looking back, I realized that silence was the first warning. Nature doesn't just fall quiet without reason. Every creature, from the smallest sparrow to the most vocal neighborhood dog, seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. I'd barely reached our sidewalk, ready to turn right toward my neighbor's house, when something made me stop. It wasn't a sound or a shadow, more like an instinct. The kind our ancestors must have developed when they were still prey more often than predator. A prickling awareness that something was fundamentally wrong with the world around me. I turned toward the eastern sky, and everything I thought I knew about reality shifted sideways. There, gliding through the air with impossible grace, was something that had no business existing in 1968. Something that shouldn't have existed for millions of years. A creature that belonged in museums and textbooks, not in the skies above urban Illinois. A living, breathing pterodactyl? The thing was massive, roughly the size of a Piper Cub aircraft. I knew the comparison was accurate because Mr. Johnson down the street was a private pilot, and I'd seen his small plane enough times to have a solid reference point. Its wingspan cast a shadow that rippled across the rooftops below, a moving reminder that this was no trick of the light, no misidentified crane or heron. Its body was a peculiar grayish blue, like storm clouds threatening rain. But what caught my eye were the patches of reddish brown that mottled its form. These weren't random splotches, but seemed to follow a pattern, almost like camouflage designed for a sky I couldn't quite imagine. The membrane of its wings stretched between elongated fingers like some prehistoric bat, each slow beat carrying it effortlessly through the air. It flew perhaps 30 feet above the neighborhood trees, close enough that I could make out details that would haunt my dreams for decades to come. Its head bore that distinctive backward swept crest, a cone of bright red extending about 2 feet from its skull. The beak, if you could call something so massive a beak, stretched at least 4 feet in length, slightly curved near the tip like some grotesque sword. The creature's movements were smooth and deliberate, with none of that erratic energy you see in modern birds. Each wing beat seemed carefully measured, as if it had mastered flight eons ago and never forgotten the lessons. Its feet remained tucked close to its body, and I could see what looked like claws or talons occasionally catching the late afternoon sun. In that moment of absolute amazement, I did what any 17-year-old might do when confronted with the impossible. I tried to share it. My eyes darted to windows, to porches, to the street itself, searching for anyone who might witness this moment with me. But the silence that had first caught my attention now felt like a curse. No cars passed on our usually busy street. No neighbors tended their yards. Even the houses themselves seemed to be holding their breath. I stood alone with my impossible sight, watching something that shouldn't exist sail across a sky that suddenly felt far too wide and empty. The reality of my isolation in that moment, the knowledge that I was possibly the only person in the modern world watching a living dinosaur, was almost too much to process. Perhaps it was the weight of that loneliness that drove me to do something incredibly foolish. I yelled. The sound felt wrong in that unnatural silence, like shouting in a church. The creature's head turned slightly at my first call, more curious than concerned, I think, like a bird trying to locate a peculiar sound. The movement was smooth, almost mechanical, its neck bending at angles that seemed to deny conventional anatomy. Encouraged by this response and driven by a desperate need to provoke some kind of reaction, any kind of reaction that was real, I shouted again, louder this time. That's when it turned its head fully toward me, and I learned the true meaning of regret. The mouth opened, revealing rows of teeth that belonged in nightmares. They lined that enormous beak like prison bars, a clear reminder that this wasn't some oversized pelican or stork. This was a predator, a hunter from an age when mammals like me knew their place in the food chain. The teeth weren't uniform but varied in size and shape, some cone-shaped, others more like serrated blades. They caught the sunlight in a way that made them gleam wet, alive, and hungry. I froze, suddenly very aware of how exposed I was on that suburban sidewalk. My mind raced through the options. Diving under a parked car, running for the nearest house, but my body refused to move. Some primitive part of my brain recognized that running might trigger a predatory response, while another part simply couldn't process what I was seeing. The creature spared me from having to decide. After what felt like an eternity, but couldn't have been more than a few seconds, mind you, it turned its head forward again and continued its westward journey. I noticed then that its tail, darker than the rest of its body, ended in what I can only describe as a spade shaped knot. This detail, so specific and clear in my memory, would later become one of the many things that convinced me I hadn't imagined the encounter. For somewhere between 60 and 90 seconds, I watched this impossible thing traverse the sky above my neighborhood. Each wing beat seemed to push against not just air, but against everything I thought I knew about the world. The late afternoon sun caught its membrane wings, making them appear almost translucent at times, revealing a network of blood vessels and tissue that no special effect could have replicated. Then, as casually as it appeared, it vanished beyond the western horizon, leaving me alone with a story I knew would be impossible to tell. The silence lingered for several minutes after the creature disappeared, as if the natural world was waiting to make sure it was truly gone before resuming its normal rhythms. Gradually, birdsongs returned. A dog barked in the distance, a car passed on Torrence Avenue. The world reset itself to normal, but I knew I never would. I only shared the story with my friend that day. What else could I do? In 1968, telling people you'd seen a living, breathing pterodactyl flying over suburban Chicago wasn't exactly a path to being taken seriously. This was the height of the space age, when science and progress were supposed to be explaining away mysteries, not creating new ones. But as the years passed, I began to care less about other skepticism. The details remained too sharp, too specific to doubt. The way its wing membranes flexed and stretched, the pattern of its teeth, the spade-shaped end of its tail. These weren't the kinds of details you'd find in the dinosaur books of the time. Many of our modern understanding of pterosaurs hadn't even been discovered yet. What strikes me most, even now, isn't just the creature itself, though, God knows, that was remarkable enough. It's honestly the location. This wasn't some remote wilderness where mysterious things might hide undiscovered. This wasn't the depths of the Amazon or the heights of the Himalayas. This was Lansing, Illinois, 1 block off Torrence Avenue, a few blocks south of a major interstate. This was civilization, with all its certainties and assumptions. Yet, there it was, defying everything we think we know about what's possible. What's instinct? What's real? Sometimes I wonder about that silence that preceded its appearance. Did it follow the creature, or did the creature seek it out? Did every living thing in the area sense what was coming and fall quiet in response? Or did something else entirely cause that unnatural hush to fall over our neighborhood? The experience changed how I viewed the world in subtle but permanent ways. I became more aware of the silence before storms, more attuned to those moments when the natural world seems to hold its breath. I started paying attention to local history, especially the stories that didn't quite fit into our neat historical narratives. I learned that the indigenous people who once lived in this area had their own tales of flying monsters, creatures that would swoop down from the sky to snatch prey from the ground. The early settlers had similar stories, usually dismissed as exaggerations or misidentifications. But after what I saw, I couldn't help but wonder how many other witnesses had kept quiet over the years, choosing silence over skepticism. The rapid development of our area in the post-war years had transformed the landscape dramatically. Where there had once been wetlands and woods, subdivisions and shopping centers now stood. Had we built our modern world on top of something older, something that occasionally broke through the thin veneer of civilization to remind us that not everything has been explained, categorized, and filed away? As I've grown older, I've heard other stories, accounts of impossible things seen in seemingly impossible places. Each one chips away at the neat categories we use to organize our world, because if a prehistoric creature can fly over suburban Illinois on a clear summer day, what else might be out there, hiding just beyond the edge of our understanding? That day in 1968 taught me that the line between possible and impossible isn't as clear as we'd like to think. Sometimes it just takes one moment, one glimpse of something that shouldn't exist to make us question everything we think we know about our world around us. The suburbs of Chicago continue to grow, spreading out like concrete fingers across the landscape. Torrence Avenue still hums with traffic and planes still cross the sky above Lansing, but sometimes, especially on quiet summer afternoons when the air feels heavy with possibility, I find myself looking up, watching for shadows that shouldn't exist, and listening for that telling silence that might herald another impossible moment. Because once you've seen something that rewrites your understanding of reality, you never stop looking for the next chapter in that story. You never stop wondering what other impossible things might be out there, flying just above the rooftops of our carefully ordered world, carrying secrets from an age we thought was lost to time. This short story was based on an encounter originally documented by the Pine Barrens Institute. Links to the original encounter, along with our other cryptid content, can be found below. And what do you think about the unnatural silence that preceded this sighting? Many cryptid witnesses report a similar phenomena. Could this be evidence that these creatures somehow affect their environment? Or do you think local wildlife simply sense their presence and respond instinctively? And maybe, do you think this was just a misidentification of something more modern? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And while you're there, don't forget to hit that follow button. If you enjoyed this encounter, please consider leaving an honest review. It helps other cryptid enthusiasts find these stories of the unexplained. And remember to keep your eyes open. You never know what you might see just on the edge of the road.